Hello and good morning. I am Laura Kelley, the co-chair of today's symposium, and thank you all for coming and for being with us today in what we find a very exciting program covering so many different dimensions. We are going to move on from geography and into archaeology, so we are going to dig into the dirt, so to speak, after discussing how the dirt got here. Let me quickly introduce our panelists and reiterate what Rebecca said, and that is on the website indigenoussymposium.tulane.edu. You can find the full biography, or full bios, I should say, of all of the panelists for today. So we have, on my left, we have John Barbry, who has served as the Director of Development and Programming for the Tunica-Biloxi Language and Culture Revitalization Program since 2014. He oversees the day-to-day administration of this program and includes the development and implementation of education programs, cultural demonstrations, workshops on Tunica and Biloxi history, languages, and traditional lifeways. He received his BA in music education at McNeese and his MA in history at UNO. And he has also assisted in the cataloging of the Tunica Treasure shortly after the collection was repatriated to the Tunica-Biloxi tribe and prior to its return to the reservation. We are going to be talking about that specifically today, and I also want to point out that they have a book for sale in the back. We have tables set up there. There on the back you'll see the book, but also Pointishan have a display there, and we welcome you during the break time to go back and take a look there and to buy Tunica-Biloxi's book. Our next guest is Chris Rodning, and he is the Paul and Deborah Gibbons Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Tulane University. He received his PhD in anthropology from UNC at Chapel Hill. He has published books and papers about archaeology of the Southern Appalachians and the Gulf South on topics such as architecture and built environment of Native American towns, earth and mounds as monuments, and more recently, responses by Native people of the Southeast to European contact and colonialism. And then we have David Watt. David Watt received his MA in 2016 from Tulane University, and he's currently a PhD student here. His research interests include social and environmental histories of cultural landscape. His dissertation focuses on crisis, social memory, and community responses to colonialism among Native American communities in the southeastern United States. He's currently working with the National Center for Preservation, Technology, and Training and developing a GIS database of a coastal response plan for at-risk deltaic historic sites for the Mississippi Delta Archaeological Mitigation Project. That is a mouthful. And did you bring any literature with you today?
No, not today.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want to find out more about this, email him because he has a lot of literature, and so much of today focuses on the tribal communities, what's happening there down along the coast, and of course that affects all of us who call Louisiana home. All right, so let's get on with the discussion. I'm going to start off with saying that archaeology excavation is inherently destructive. And so I guess to start off with a general question is, what can we learn from archaeological sites through excavation? What makes excavation valuable to certain sites and at certain scales? And I should add that by professionals as opposed to amateurs. And I wanted to ask that question of Chris and Dave.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you all for participating today. Archaeologists dig sites to learn what life was like in the past and to collect evidence that enables us to make arguments about culture change over long periods of time. And archaeology is, in some ways, a destructive activity. We dig deposits that then are no longer there. which means that it's our professional obligation to document exactly what we dig and how we dig and where we dig, and to document very carefully what we find. So the first point I would say in response to your question is that for professional archaeologists, one of the most important obligations we have is documentation and publication of our results, and sharing the knowledge that we generate in publications and public venues and museums and in other modes. A second point I would make is that we rarely dig entire archaeological sites. And in fact, we rarely dig a large percentage of most archaeological sites. And most archaeologists today are very conscious about preserving either entire sites that are deemed worthy of preservation or preserving sections of sites, both for the sake of preservation, and I will come to some other considerations about managing archaeological sites from different perspectives. But we also do that in part because in the future there will be techniques of archaeological data recovery that we may not even be able to imagine at present. If we were having this meeting 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, there would be archaeological techniques in use today that weren't even imagined back then. And I don't know what they'll be 20 or 30 years from now, but my student David Watt will figure that out. We prefer to save deposits at archaeological sites in part because there will be new techniques that enable us to gather important information in the future. And ultimately what's important is not so much what we find, but what we find out, what we can learn about the past. Yeah. A third point in response to Laura's question here that I'd like to offer is that archaeological sites are of interest not just to archaeologists, but to other people and other interests as well. Yeah. There are valid reasons to preserve sites of historic and cultural significance, both from the perspective of land management and conservation, but also from the perspective of the values of descendant communities, in particular with respect to my own interests and involvement and a lot of our focus thus far here today, in particular members of contemporary Native American communities who are the ancestors of the people who lived at the archaeological sites that we study. There are different ways of thinking about the sites that archaeologists are interested in digging, and that necessitates some consideration in archaeological research design.
Yeah, thank you. John, I'd like to ask you the next question because it kind of leads into what Chris was just speaking about, and your experience with the Tunica Treasure, and if you want to give some background to the audience about that.
Yes, the quote-unquote Tunica Treasure was discovered by an amateur, I don't know if we'd call him an archaeologist or a pot hunter, back in around 1967. He was a prison guard at Angola prison, and through some research, he and his magnometer, you call it the electromagnometer or whatever it is,
detector?
he was able to detect metal under the ground. So he came across a burial site of a early 18th century Tunica village, and dug up about 2.5 tons of artifacts, and a lot of the artifacts were of European trade goods, and he tried to find a buyer for the materials. He made the acquaintance of Dr. Jeffrey Brain from the Peabody Museum at Harvard, and who got a chance to do some analysis of the collection. But he was trying to sell it, but the thing was, he had dug this up on private property. They called it the Trudeau plantation or Trudeau site, and so he could not prove that he had ownership, and so the Peabody Museum could not, felt like they couldn't buy this from him. So he sued the owners of the property. Meanwhile, the state took ownership, had ownership of the site eventually, and they sued him. And he sued the owners to try to get, rights to the materials. But the tribe, the Tunica-Biloxi tribe, who really came into this equation later, the case, I think, got to court in the early 70s, but the tribe, the Tunica-Biloxi tribe, we just had recently gained federal recognition in 1981, and it was only after that we joined the suit, and the state supported our position, because even the state did not fully acknowledge that the collection was attributed to our modern community, the Tunica-Biloxi people. So eventually they were on board and supported us, and through a state case, the collection was repatriated to the Tunica-Biloxi people, and that was in 1985. The tribe hired a local archaeological firm, Goodwin and Associates, to do an inventory of the collection, and I was brought on as an intern to be trained in their lab and to actually catalog or inventory the collection. So we had another tribal member who joined us later, Rose White, so after training out in Harahan, we were shipped down to the old U.S. Mint, which had been through a lot of different phases, and we were in this floor where we had all these boxes. And so we set up some tables. We had our little tools and pens and different things to label things, labels and so forth. And so I had my perch overlooking Decatur, and we would take one box at a time and go through things, a variety of different things. The Tunica Treasure is made up of a lot of iron tools, both European and indigenous pottery, and beads. Lord, there was a lot of beads, large bead collection. So, some of them seed beads so small that you basically had just to weigh them to kind of give it an idea of how many were in the container. So it was a tedious thing, but just out of graduate school and sort of was just really appreciating the significance of what this collection did as far as telling the story of our Tunica people. And so in that way it was good. The long process toward federal recognition included a lot of research and connecting our community to its historic background. Historically the Tunica were encountered DeSoto, or DeSoto encountered us upriver, northwestern Arkansas, northwestern Mississippi, northeastern Arkansas. Of course, our people migrated downriver, but the site, like at Trudeau, that was just north of Point Capee, close to Angola Prison, and so it was at that time where. There's a story about an attack of, we invited Natchez into our village one evening, and we feasted and sang and played, probably had some games or whatever, and after we went to sleep, the Natchez turned on us. They had a little bit of resentment built up, and so
all those beads.
Yeah, so right, all those. They knew we had beads. So at that village, the attack there, is from that village site around 1730 that this cemetery or this funeral area was probably developed, and so that kind of dates the Tunica Treasure.
And I want to hop in there because I'd like to mention to the audience, the Tunica Treasure is considered the most significant find for the United States, period, of any Native American tribe, community, site, however you want to label it, the most significant. And John's not exaggerating when he says 2.5 million, pieces, tons, etc. There were the amateur person who found it was storing it everywhere, all over the house and friends' and garages and you name it. And it's one of those examples, and I think Chris kind of picked up on this when I said the difference with a professional excavation, because what he did was just pull stuff from the ground, and the whole context of it was lost completely. And what things were grouped with each other and in this site. This was also before the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990. So before then, tribes really didn't have, they'd have to go through the courts and test their luck there with trying to get items back, and that also includes human remains and things like that. So it was examples like this, I think, that led to that law in 1990.
Yes, our state case
Yeah.
was one of the initial cases that really I set precedent for the
Yeah.
federal law.
Right,
Yes, yeah.
okay. So Dave, let me ask you a question. What makes archaeology of the lower Mississippi Valley, coastal Louisiana, important, interesting, different from other places?
Sure. So Louisiana in particular is really important to essentially the United States in terms of archaeology. We have some of the earliest sites here for mound construction at Watson Brake. Poverty Points is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world as a World Heritage Site, and one of 7, I believe, cultural sites. So it's incredibly important. Coastal Louisiana also is particularly unique in the fact that so many of these sites are at risk right now. We got 98% roughly of these archaeological sites in the coastal zone are at risk of subsidence and erosion in the next 50 to 100 years or so.
So what's the plan of action then? Just wash away literally,
No.
or what's
So
the hope?
essentially what we're attempting to do right now on a variety of different projects is essentially triage in an attempt to work with a lot of different coastal communities, including tribal communities, to engage with these groups of people to find out what sites are out there, what is important to these communities, what specifically do the communities want done, as well as the professional community. All of these sites are at extreme risk. The risk is not slowing down, it's only speeding up, especially as we continue to channel the Mississippi as Dr. Campanella was pointing out earlier. So the risk for these sites is pretty incredible, and what we're really trying to do is go out and essentially mitigate that damage. So that's really what we're trying to do moving forward, is sampling these sites, as Chris was pointing out, that we don't want to necessarily excavate all of these sites, but to learn as much as we can while they're still terrestrial.
I like that term, terrestrial, i.e. above water as opposed to below water. Yeah.
May I just jump in and add to that? A lot of work by archaeologists is done in the context of analyzing artifacts and analyzing photographs and maps of what we find at archaeological sites. And I spoke a few minutes ago about some of the destructive aspects of digging sites and removing deposits and artifacts from their context. Laura referred to the term context and provenience, which is fundamental in archaeology. There are a lot of techniques that archaeologists use, though, that are non-destructive. And remote sensing and the ability to look at the locations of sites over large areas, near-surface remote sensing and geophysical survey, including metal detecting, but also ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, which identifies magnetic anomalies, which usually represent burning events, and other kinds of techniques like that are either non-invasive and non-destructive or minimally invasive and minimally destructive. And meanwhile, analysis of what we know about all these sites, like Dave is mentioning here and is doing actually at the moment, is facilitated by the management of archaeological databases by academic archaeologists like me, based at universities, but also private firms that engage in archaeology, like the firm Goodwin that John worked with on this project he was talking about, and state agencies like the Louisiana Division of Archaeology, and increasingly, and I find this very exciting, Native American communities who have their own tribal historic and archaeology programs and maintain their own databases. And analysis of site distributions and artifacts from known archaeological sites is a valuable and important effort, and it takes a lot of time, and I would suggest we can learn a lot about what life was like in the past, even from studying what we already have out of the ground.
Right. Along similar lines, John, as a member of the Tunica-Biloxi tribe, what is it that contemporary Native Americans would want to learn from an archaeological site? Do you have a different perspective? Do you have different questions? What would you hope to gain?
Well, so many indigenous groups, their oral traditions have been faded by the cultural trauma, and so much of the oral traditions and history is lost to a lot of community members, and so the outcome, the information that's derived from these archaeological studies help fill in some pieces of our distant past. Mm-hmm. For us, using the Tunica Treasure as an example, we were repatriated these items right after our federal recognition. So it was, at that time, it was sort of an affirmation of our cultural past and the link of our modern community with the past. And so it was beneficial in that way. It kind of helped us with our sense of identity from a historical group. So in that way, it was good. Of course, I know, we talked about destructive effects, but and that is something that I think has changed over the years. I think there's more work between the anthropologists and archaeologists and the communities, in most cases, to approach it in a respectful way. I'm all for science, but if you go in and start destroying things without any consultation, it's a bad thing. So, but there are things. It fills in pieces of information for us, and things that maybe we've lost touch with in our modern society.
Yeah, I think bringing up Dave's point, also the richness in all these sites, and that I think us as a broader community would say, let's learn more about what's here. And one of the things that Rebecca and I talked about is wanting to kind of correct this notion that many Americans have, and that is that this was a wide open empty space, that Europeans came over, and that there was the token Indian tribe here and there, and that certainly wasn't the case when Iberville and Bienville arrived. There were 35 different tribes with 8 different linguistic groups that were living along in the Mississippi River Valley just down here that we're aware of. And the coastal areas with all of these sites give us an idea of the richness and how populated this area was. And as Rich spoke about, there was good reason for it. There was land, it produced things. One of the most shocking things I read about in the early 18th century were buffalo being down in Lower Bayou Lafourche. I was like, buffalo, wow, okay. Imagine seeing that.
I developed a friendship with an archaeologist when I was working with Goodwin, and we eventually became roommates when I was in graduate school here. And I used to joke with him. I used to say, we're so grateful to archaeologists for inventing Indians, and it was tongue in cheek, but there was some truth to that, So that was our going joke,
Yeah. Okay, so I'll throw this out to any of you, especially because, John, you have an MA in history, and we've got 2 archaeologists. And I'm an historian, I should say, so this is a little bit of a loaded question. What can we learn from archaeology that we cannot necessarily learn from history? Or flip it on its head, what can we learn from history that we can't necessarily learn from archaeology?
Before the archaeologists get too far into the weeds,
This is what I need here.
The Tunica people, the historical record from, say, the 16th century is there. But before that, I mean, we existed long before that. So there is some archaeology that's done, I guess, we call it the proto historic period. There is some, I guess, 16th century sites north of where we encountered DeSoto. So some of that is, shows, that we've been here and that we were here for a long time, and but also shows our pattern of movement downriver, and for various reasons, opposing tribes, colonial influence with tribes that pushed us down, and our dwindling population because of disease and other things that were brought here by the Europeans. But so it tells that story and a little bit more in depth about the people and how they lived and what they ate and what they threw
Daily
away.
life,
And
yeah.
So it connects some of these dots together. So
Okay. Chris and Dave, you want to add to that?
History is written from a certain perspective, right? And written documents, whether penned by English speakers or French speakers or speakers of other European languages, record observations from those perspectives. And those are valuable, they're interesting, and they're meaningful. And I think they're important in archaeology. But they don't capture the whole story. They don't capture the details of everyday life. They don't necessarily capture the long period of occupation and cultural history and culture change for Native Americans. And archaeology is a way of accessing sites that give us, archaeological sites that give us information about what life was like at many different points in the past. And one way to put it would be that Native people have lived in Louisiana for at least 10 or 15,000 years. And on the one hand, there are important historical continuities from way back in the Ice Age to today. On the other hand, there are important changes. And I think archaeology is a valuable set of techniques and tools and conceptual approaches to trying to understand cultural continuity and change at those kinds of timescales.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This is one of the things when you're teaching students, and that is that all of our letters, are coming from outside sources, when we're dealing with the colonial period. So it's the French perspective, it's the English perspective. And we have to kind of sift through them and try to get a fuller picture, and archaeology certainly fills in a lot of those gaps. What I'd like to end with is having each one of you talk about a personal experience. Dave, Chris, with you is specifically with writing, with excavating, something that surprised you, something working a particular site that caught you off guard, give a little context what that site is. And John, I'd like for you to think back to the Tunica Treasure, and what was your favorite piece or most unusual or thing that surprised you when you were cataloging all of those tens of thousands of items. So Dave, we'll start with you.
Sure. So for my dissertation work, I work at a 18th century battlefield site, this last site of the Natchez, a battlefield site between the French and the Natchez. And perhaps one of the things that has surprised me most is that we approach archaeological sites oftentimes with knowledge of other sites or historical contingencies about what we should be expecting when we go there. And I suppose the thing that has surprised me most is having this baggage of French documentation from the French perspective, and then seeing it, seeing it archaeologically through the Natchez perspective a little bit is always a little bit of a, not necessarily a shock, but it's always, it's not what you would expect necessarily.
So what did you not expect?
We have this fort that conventionally should be a French-style fortification, and we're finding out that it's perhaps actually Mississippian. It's a Natchez-style Native American fortification that's running very different from what we'd be expecting based on what we see in Mississippi. So things that are going on at these sites are always very complex. People are much more complex than often one perspective of that narrative shows. So getting both of those, melding the archaeology and the historic narrative, has been always really fun for me.
And let me just pop right in there, because he mentioned the word architecture. And architecture is one of those intrinsic aspects to archaeology that most people don't consider. They think about the artifacts, but not necessarily the structures. And structures are inherently reflection of a culture, whether it's a palmetto hut down south or, you know, a Creole cottage, but they do reflect a culture and a people, and they tell us much about it. So the fact that the architecture of that fort is indigenous or appears to be leaning that way and not French is highly significant. Chris?
Since 2001, I've been a co-director of an archaeological project in Western North Carolina focused on interactions between Native American communities and Spanish explorers and conquistadors and colonists from the mid-1500s, mid-16th century. We're interested in the nature of the interaction between the Native community and the Spanish colonists who were there from 1566 to 1568. We've been working at this site for 17 years now. We knew that the site was the location of a Native American town that we had a name of from historic records, and we knew that that was the location of a Spanish colonial town and fort. But we had never found the actual remnants of the fort itself. Like many Native American towns across the southeast United States, there was once a large earthen mound at this site. And at this particular site, it was probably about 15 feet tall. It was plowed down, but we think there are remnants of that mound still in the field, and we have to dig to figure that out. And that's one of the reasons why it's valuable to dig, I think. We thought we were digging deposits that represented this mound, a Native American construction. And we were trying to figure out where it was located and maybe figure out when it dates and so forth. And in 2013, so 13 years after we started, we realized in looking at deposits in the ground that that wasn't a Native American mound, it was a Spanish fort. It was a ditch, a moat surrounding a Spanish fort, a different kind of fort than what Dave is studying. And so one of the reasons I want to emphasize this particular story is that my colleagues and our students and I had been working at this site for a long time. And we knew a lot about it, and we had published papers about it. And suddenly, we made a find that completely changed our understanding of that space, and continues to be an interesting find that we're studying today. I'm going to cheat a little bit here and throw in another commentary in response to Laura's prompt. It doesn't really relate to digging at an archaeological site, but I'm fascinated by Native American oral tradition and the way that oral traditions are valuable interpretive frameworks for understanding archaeology and archaeological evidence. There are many variations on what we might call an earth diver myth in Native American oral traditions. Some animal, up north it's often a beaver, in the mountains for the Cherokee, it's a water beetle. For the Chitimacha here in southeastern Louisiana, it's a crawfish, not surprisingly. In one Chitimacha oral tradition, the world was covered in water until the crawfish went down to the bottom and pulled mud up from the bottom, and when the mud reached the surface of the water, it spread out to form the land that's here today. I remember reading that a couple of years ago, or more than that, and being struck at how that is a very concise summary of the process, the geological processes that Professor Campanella very articulately described just a little while ago. And I think it's a really good summary of how earthen mounds are built by Native American people. And I was really struck at how that instance of a Native American oral tradition becomes a valuable framework for understanding not only geological processes, but histories of monument building and architecture that we can study at archaeological sites.
Well, I think it shows the value of collaboration and for all parties being part of the process.
You asked about favorite
the
experience
most.
in the inventory project of the Tunica Treasure? Well, of course, you know, it was just the feeling of being among items that were handled by my ancestors. That was a sort of a strange emotional thing that came over me when I was among this collection. It was all the beautiful European items, especially the ceramics and so forth, but I think the ones that really meant more to me were the indigenous pottery made by Tunica, and some of this pottery was trade items, some Caddo examples. So just to be there and to handle it with care and to think about where it came from, and you know, was very impactful to me. I have to share a story. It's an archaeology story. Back in the 30s, there was a WPA project done. I think there was an archaeologist, Ford might have been with them. They were doing a survey dig at what is now called the Marksville Commemorative Site. There's mounds there. Of course, the Tunica-Biloxi people came to this area in the late 18th century. But when we got word, some of our tribal men went out and actually stopped them from digging. They felt like they were desecrating sacred ground. And of course, the archaeologists tried to explain that they were researching cultures from long past. But the area meant something to our people. There were some 19th century burials in the area, but we saw this place as a sacred site. The Tunica were from the mound building civilizations. Of course, by that time, you know, I think the Marksville site is what, 1400, something like that, years old. And there was a conversation, heated conversation, and eventually our tribal men relented. But I think the conversation there between the archaeologists and our people was important. And it sort of illustrates how it should be done. The conversation should have happened before they dug anything, but it did happen, which was important. So,
Yeah. And may that conversation continue. Thank you very much.